All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College Application and Website Development, or AWD, 1111 Database-Driven Web Development class, I've been doing a series of video presentations. I started by creating approximately 20 or so presentations based on Mr. Flavio Cope's and some of the client-side server PDFs he's created in his Valley of Code website. Now I've switched over, and this is actually what I should have done first, to talk about Brad Traversy's web dev guide. Mr. Traversy is a self-taught developer. He's the owner, president, CEO, whatever, of TraversyMedia.com. And he's got tons of free stuff out there and other stuff you can pay for to make you a web dev guru. And so far, this is 306 pages, and I've done the first 64. So I'm on page 65, and we're going to talk about CSS frameworks. So he says here, before you go to learn JavaScript, you have the option to learn a framework. One thing I want to mention is that it's extremely important, in his opinion, and I agree with this. You really have to understand both HTML and CSS before you jump into a framework. But the two frameworks I believe he mentions here, those being Bootstrap and Tailwind, they're extensions of CSS. They supercharge CSS, whatever you want to say. So yeah, you've got to understand what goes on under the hood here. Once you can create a decent looking website with just HTML and CSS, you may want to look into learning a framework because they can help you speed up your projects. My personal opinion is that you should learn one of these because learning the basics is pretty easy. Frameworks can speed up projects' development time, but even if you don't use them in production, they can be good for development to get stuff up and running. Now, we've talked Bootstrap already, and Bootstrap, as it says, is currently on version 5. All right. It says, I think it's probably worth learning for the simple fact that you'll run into it at one time or another. Also, if you learn Bootstrap and understand how it works, you pretty much can understand any type of framework, aside, as it says, from maybe Tailwind, which is done differently. So Tailwind is a bit different from the rest. It's low level. So you almost, for lack of better wordage, are doing programming here. All right, it says Bootstrap is high level, meaning you can use the class of alert or button and you'll get the CSS styling. With Tailwind, what it does is it provides low level base classes. All right, it says, for instance, the class of text center will add a text align center, and the one of MR1 will add a margin on the right. So instead of having component classes, you use utilities and create your own components. A downside, as it says there, is you can end up having a lot more classes in your HTML. But the benefit is you can customize things and you'll be able to reuse them. All right, so as always, there's a plus and a minus. All right. As it says there, Tailwind may seem a bit annoying at first because of the number of classes, but it grew on him and is now his favorite CSS framework. And as you would probably guess, if I go out here as I did before and we looked, in here under his, notice there's his flex box, there's his grid, and if we look long enough, let's see, let's just bring this up. And I'm going to put in here Brad Traversy Bootstrap 5. And there should be his crash course. Bootstrap 5 crash course from a year ago. And again, it's over an hour long. And I'm sure if I looked in here long enough or put in here Tailwind, CSS, there is his Tailwind crash course. Now you notice that's 3 years old. He's upgraded and now he's got a Tailwind project that he does from scratch. Part of the problem with this stuff, and you all know this, I know I'm preaching to the choir in many ways here, and that is It's very hard to learn everything. All right. Most people just don't have the time when they can sit back and go over everything they might need. So, and I realize it can be very tough to come in and try to pick out what you think is the most important. There's Materialize. It's another one. I think this is Bulma. I've never used that one. I've never used Foundation. Okay. All right. Developer environments. CDNs. A CDN is a content delivery network. So as an example, and you've seen this before. So again, I realize that this is at least a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Redundant. All right, but if I come in here and I go to jquery.com, all right, and I go to download jQuery, I've got different ways that I can do this download. All right. If I go down long enough, I can download it using a CDN, a content delivery network. So a content delivery network has already got what I need and I can download it. That's the good news. All right. The bad news is I'll need an internet connection to make sure that that works. So for instance, with jQuery, if I go to Google CDN, all right, and I want the latest and greatest version, let's see, somewhere in here, there's jQuery. I put in this. And you notice that rather than me having to host the jQuery, I'm grabbing it from the Google site. All right. A CDN is great for small projects, but in a real production site, you'll probably want to include the actual CSS file in your project. For one thing, you can't do any customization. The Bootstrap buttons will look like they do on a million other sites. Also, the user has to be connected to the internet. So that's part of the problems with a CDN. If you really want to customize your layouts, you'll need some kind of a local development environment. All right. Each framework is different. You could even create your own framework if you had the time and the desire to do so. All right. Now they're going to talk in here about next about UX and UI. UX is the user experience. UI is the user interface. It's interesting. My oldest daughter has her degree in psychology. All right. She's had it. Oh, she probably graduated 10 years ago from college. All right. The reason that I'm telling you that is many people over the years who have gotten psychology degrees, and she is not one of these people, but have gotten jobs at companies working in the UX or user experience field. UX, the user experience, is really, for lack of better words, how you feel about the website. The user interface is what the website looks like. So UI design, he says, is something I think is important to understand as a front-end web developer or web designer. The bigger the company that you work at, the more refined the different things are going to be. So you might be a web developer and never do any user interface work. If you're freelancing or if you work at a smaller company where you wear many hats, as it says, you should have at least somewhat of an eye for design. So he talks about things like color contrast. Remember, again, I've mentioned this before in other classes, that approximately 10% of the world is colorblind. So you want to make sure you've got enough color contrast between your font and the background so that people can distinguish one from the other. White space, you want to use white space, but you don't want to overuse white space. And it's interesting. I've noticed that in the past, I'll find some students, when they'll show me their resume, they're going to go to a job fair or they've got a job interview or whatever. And what sticks out on their resume is how much white space there is. They've got everything kind of congregated into the center. And you really, that's what sticks out, not the content of the resume, but how much white space there is. So you should use the right amount, but not too much. And it's a game, for lack of better words. that you've got to learn to play. Scale refers to the relative size of one element compared to another. That's one of the reasons, for example, you don't put H1 tags all over the same web page. Visual hierarchy, it says it's used to rank design elements and influence the order in which you want your users to view them. You already all know this, but typically, in most, at least in the United States, people read from left to right and up and down. Okay. Typography, as it says, it's the art of arranging letters and text in a way that makes it visually appealing. All right. Then we jump into JavaScript, also known as JS. So it says, so far up to this point, we've been concerned with creating basic websites, that's the HTML, and making them look nice, that's the CSS. Now it's time to add the interactivity. It says JavaScript may very well be the main language you work with if you're going to be a back-end developer or a full-stack developer. There are other languages that you can use, especially for full-stack development as well. JavaScript front-end frameworks are popular. All right, it says in some cases people move to them too fast. You have to understand JavaScript. Just like you really should understand CSS before you go to a framework such as Bootstrap or Tailwind CSS, you should understand JavaScript before you go to a JavaScript framework. So here's some things that you should understand. These are all things you should have at least had a good fundamental exposure to in the AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies class. I'm not going to read to you. You should have an understanding of how to use the DOM, the Document Object Model. And this is going to be even more important when we get to where we start talking about React, which is part of that MERN stack that I mentioned to you earlier, MongoDB, Express, React, and Node. The reason for that is when you are working with React, working with the DOM, the Document Object Model here, believe it or not, it allows you to go and, for lack of better verbiage, it allows you to go in and manipulate anything on a web page. That's the good news. The bad news is, by and large, working with the DOM can be a very slow process. All right? When you get to React, you don't work directly with the DOM. You work with what's called a virtual DOM. And you make your changes to the virtual DOM. Then the virtual DOM goes in, and rather than updating the entire DOM or the entire document object model, the virtual DOM just goes in and updates what needs to be updated. So there's a lot of stuff we could talk about with the DOM. I'm not going to. All right. You should be familiar with get element by ID. You should be familiar with get elements by tag name, get elements by class name, etc. You should understand the query selector. All right, so you can use the query, you can use either get element by ID or query selector. And there's also query selector all if you want to find every one of these. All right. One of the things that we talked about towards the end of the JavaScript review was this, asynchronous programming. It says JavaScript is a single-threaded language, meaning only one thing can happen at a time. This makes asynchronous programming very important. Many times, rather than waiting for a task to finish, we want to keep things moving, so we use asynchronous code. And you've seen these before. The hallmarks of these are callbacks, promises, and async await. We've already talked about callbacks, which is the way it used to be done. You'll still find plenty of code out there that uses callbacks. But callbacks can lead to callback hell, and we talked about this in the JavaScript review. From there, we kind of went over to promises. And a promise can be in one of three states. All right, it can be resolved. meaning that whatever you put in there worked. It can be rejected, meaning what you put in there didn't work. And it can be pending. From there, we went to async await, which is an extension of promises. All right, but it allows you to basically take whatever you're working on and put async in front of it, and then whatever needs to basically wait, you can put in a wait there. All right. I think it's going to be very important that we understand what you see on this screen right now. All right. When you want to go out to an API or an application program interface, so when you want to go out to an API to grab information, for instance, one of the projects in here, I'm hoping at least we're going to be able to work on, we will go out to the open, what is it, weather, I think it's openweathermap.org. All right. And we will try to set something up so that when we go out there, you will go in and sign up for your own API key, and it's free. All right. So here it says search city. I'm going to put in Wentzville, where I am right now. And search. It says Wentzville, US. So it says the current temperature. Notice it's in centigrade. So it's 26 degrees centigrade. And it also gives some information in here. Right, you can see this. Now you can change it. You can go in and you can change the weather, the metric in here. All right, there. We changed it over here to Fahrenheit. Notice it's 79 degrees. It's supposed to be 100 today, and you can see what's going on in here. Okay. All right, so why, fine, Jeff, why did you tell me that? Well, what we are doing there is we're going out to an API. When you grab information from an API, from an application program interface, and you put it into your program, there's different ways that you can do it. The fetch API is one of them. You can use a product or something called Axios, and we'll talk about these in class. All right. So the fetch API, as it says there, it allows you to make requests asynchronously because you don't know how much time they're going to take. You typically use the API in your application to be able to, not so much with a weather app, but with other things, to be able to do CRUD operations, to be able to create things, read things, update things, and delete things. The author says, as a back-end developer, you need to understand HTTP because you're going to be creating APIs. As a front-end developer, all right, it says you build the part of the app that consumes the APIs. All right, he'll talk about REST APIs later. All right, so this JSON placeholder right here that he talks about, okay, you can go out there, and what it has, for lack of better words, is it's got a lot of fake data. So it says this uses the fetch API to get a list of users from this URL. So if we go out there, and if I come out here, this is JSON right here. This is an array. So at the beginning, there's that. And at the end, you'll see the ending one. And each of the things that goes in here, this is an array of JSON objects. I'm going to make this smaller so you can see all of it. So this is one object. You can see the person's ID, their name, their username, their email, their address. And notice their address is made up of yet another object. All right. Their phone, their website, and the company they work for. Then another one. This is all mythical data. Just so you're aware of that. Okay? All right. When using fetch, as they show right there, it returns a promise. We've already talked about these promises. And it says we handle that with a .then method. Well, this means try to do this. If it works, then do this. If that works, then do this. Typically down on the bottom, you'll have one or more also dot catches so that if something doesn't work, you'll be able to handle it accordingly. You will take control over what happens as opposed to the system taking control. As mentioned, and I've already shown you a little of it, most modern APIs return data in JSON, JavaScript object notation format. The advantage of doing that is, as it says here, JSON format looks similar to a JavaScript object. The other way that you can return data, all right, if need be, is typically in an XML format, which is extensible markup language format. All right, array methods. Here are some examples of popular array methods. Well, if you notice, what does he have here? He's got about a half dozen of them. We looked at for each, and it's a way, for each is designed to work with arrays and to loop over them. And as you're looping over them, as it says, execute a callback or run a function on each element. Map, as it says there, creates a new array. So notice that both map creates a new array and filter creates a new array. All right? They work very similarly. Sort, we've already seen, to sort in ascending or descending order. We also looked a little bit at reduce, all right, to apply a function against an accumulator. And I mentioned in the earlier example, if I had 12 students and I gave a test that was worth 100 points, that would mean that if every student got an A, that would be 1,200 points total. But if I wanted to check and see how many points were actually achieved by my students, all right, then rather than using that, one way I could do it would be to use reduce. Find, which does just that. Okay, here's an example of a filter. It says get all the words from an array that have a length greater than 6 and put them into a variable. All right, so this is going to create an array. So notice there's 5, 5, 5, I don't know how many, but there's more than 6. There's more than 6, and there's more than 6. So this says we want to take the words array and we want to filter it. Each word in the words array, we want to run against it. And if the word length is greater than 6, we want to add it to result. So that'll add exuberant, destruction, and present, because all 3 of those are more than 6 letters. All right. Jquery. We still go over Jquery in the AWD 1000 class. One of the big things that has happened over time is Jquery has become less important because of the fact that JavaScript has grown so much that much of the things you needed to do in Jquery, which as it says here is a JavaScript library, can now be done almost natively using regular JavaScript itself. Another thing that happened was with the advent of Bootstrap 5. So when Bootstrap went to Bootstrap 5, they decided to virtually remove all of their Jquery that was in there. Now, Traversy says, today I don't think I would suggest learning Jquery. The only reason I may is because you might run into it at some point. All right. Extra programming tools. Well, we've talked about Git since almost day 1 in here. It's going to be interesting this semester because I am going to have a new group of students in my AWD 1100 Programming Fundamentals with C# class. As of right now, today, August 3rd, 2022, I have 12 students in the class. I don't know how many of them will have already taken the AWD 1000 class with Mr. Gudmested this summer. All right. But I'm going to imagine there'll be at least some that have not, so we'll have to go over Git. All right. Now, Git has changed over time. Git, you used to have to pay to make private repositories. You don't anymore. A few years ago, rather than teaching Git, all right, we were using GitHub, but rather than Git, we were using Bitbucket because it's free. But now we basically learn Git. And as it says, the basics are pretty easy to learn. We've gone through all these. You do the git init to initialize or start a Git repository, a git add, and if you want to add everything to your staging area, it's a git add space dot or period. Then you commit and you put a message in there. That's what's after the -m. Then you can, if you are sending something, for lack of better words, if you are sending something from your local machine to your GitHub account, typically that's what you'd use. All right, you're doing a push. If you are cloning or grabbing something from a GitHub server and pulling it down to your local machine, you're doing a pull. You can also do branching, and I'm not going to go through that right now. Markdown, as it says, is a lightweight language for creating formatted text. For instance, it's what Git uses for its README files. All right. And my guess is, if you look, I have no idea. Here's some examples of it. All right. And let's see. Come on, Jeff, type. Yep, Traversy even has, it's 4 years old, but he has a Markdown crash course. It's not even very long. All right, if you're interested. Okay. NPM. This is the first time we're talking about something that's going to be related to Node. All right. When we get into the point where we're working with Node, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to go out to node.js. Or no, I'm sorry, Node, what is it? Nodejs.org, I believe it is. Yeah, it is. Very simple site. That's what's in it. And we are going to pick out the long-term support, which is the LTS. We're going to click on that, and we're going to download Node so we can start working with it. One of the first things we'll do after we do that is we're going to go to npmjs.org. And this, again, a very simplistic looking website, but it is the Node package manager. So if I decide, for example, one of the first things we're going to learn about in here will be Express. So I type in Express, all right, and I click that. And it brings me to the npm.js. npm is Node package manager, and it brings me to the Express page. How popular is Express? Well, it's being downloaded 20 million times a week, so it's fairly popular, should be fairly stable. And they tell you in here how you download it. They tell you in here how you bring it into your program. They tell you in here what it's supposed to do. And when you get a bigger package like this, it even has its own GitHub page. So you can see, that might not be that much. This is all the code. But when you go down, again, there's some how to use it. There's the installation, some of the features, a quick start, etc. And we'll be looking at all that. So why did I waste your time for 5 minutes to tell you that we're going to be using Node Package Manager a lot? Rather than using Node, it is also possible to use something that's called Yarn. It's another package manager. It says the commands are a bit different, but they both use the Node Package Manager. All right, the same repository. Don't worry about it. We're not going to do anything with Yarn. The browser dev tools, we've already looked at these. All right, so when I bring this up and I go into here and I tell it that I want it to run open this in Live Server, and I get this page, this ugly page that I've been playing with, and I right mouse click and I choose Inspect, I'm bringing up my browser tools. So I can go in and look at all sorts of different things, change things on the fly, etc. if I'm so inclined. These are those tabs that are in there: the Elements tab, the Console tab, the Network tab, the Application tab, and the Performance tab. All right. Text editor, extensions, and plugins. We've looked a little at some of the plugins that are available to you in Visual Studio Code. One that you're supposed to get out of the box is Emmet. We've looked at Emmet. We've looked at Live Server. We'll look at Prettier and ESLint. All right. And we're going to do something where this is going to be different, where the AWD1111 class is going to be different than what we've done previously. Is we're going to be deploying stuff in here, not to like GitHub Forms. We will deploy to Netlify, and that's for front-end projects. We will deploy, well, it doesn't show it in here, but to Heroku for back-end projects. I've never used Vercel. I've done some work with cPanel. All right, not going to talk about any of that stuff. Domain names, I'm not going to talk about this. Other than to say, I don't think it would be a bad idea. So let's say that we've got a person in our class, okay? And the person in our class, I'm going to give them a name that's probably not a real common name. Let's say we've got Jack Williamson. It just popped into my head. So if I come through here and I type in jackwilliamson.com and I hit enter, you'll notice that domain is available. I don't think it would be a bad idea if you can afford it. Now, I'm not telling you to go out and spend money, but what I'm telling you is, as an example, one of my students who graduated about 3 years ago, his name is Luke Gosnell. And what Luke did, this is before he even came to Rankin. He grabbed the domain lukegosnell.com, and there's Luke. All right. What better way to showcase your stuff than to have your own domain name on your own website? All right. Let's just review here what we should know up to this point. The recap, we talked about HTML and CSS. It says you should be able to create decent looking websites with HTML5 and CSS, really CSS3. HTML5 is the newest, CSS3 is the newest. Understand most basic design principles. Understand the use of JavaScript to make web pages interactive and how JavaScript can be used to work with the document object model. How to at least what you do to connect to an application program interface and make a request, and that should be via, not v's, via fetch. How to work with Git, how to deploy and manage small production projects, and it says where to go from here. All right, it says, so now that you know this, you have a few choices. It says you can go the web designer route. You can go the front end framework, and that's what he recommends that you do here. You can go to the back end, or look at some advanced JavaScript. Well, what we're going to do next, because I'm done with this presentation, is we're going to jump into front end advanced, and I'll be back with that shortly.